Crystal glasses shatter on the ballroom floor. A young master defies his father's rage and kisses the slave girl before 50 horrified guests, shattering an engagement that could save the plantation. But this girl remembers everything she sees, every word, every seal pressed in wax, every letter scratched in fading ink. When the banker arrives with papers to seize the estate, she notices something wrong. The seal doesn't match. Thunder rolls. Patrol riders circle the house. A pistol clears leather in the front parlor. Hidden in the family Bible lies a promise written 25 years ago, a secret that could free her or get them all killed. The courthouse steps fill with witnesses. 3 rings lie on the judge's table, but only one tells the truth. When the gavel falls and the crowds gather, will a slave girl's perfect memory be enough to rewrite who belongs to whom, or will speaking the truth cost her everything she's ever loved? Dawn crept over the Harwood plantation like smoke through tall grass. In the kitchen house, Lissy's bare feet found the worn places in the pine boards. She hummed while she worked a low, sweet hymn that settled in her chest like warm honey. The ribbon on her wrist caught the first lamplight. Blue silk, faded now, but still soft against her dark skin. She touched it once, the way she always did at daybreak, then reached for the flour sack. "Mind that dusting," called Aunt Dinah from the hearth. "Don't go making clouds." But Lissy was already tracing letters in the scattered flour on the work table. A, B, C. The shapes came easy to her fingers. From the main house, she could hear young Master William reciting his lessons on the front porch. She moved her lips without sound, matching each letter he called out. The kitchen door creaked. Aunt Dinah's wooden spoon paused mid-stir. "You best wipe that clean, child." Lissy swept the flour smooth. The letters disappeared, but not from her mind. Nothing ever disappeared from her mind. Every word she heard, every mark she glimpsed, stayed put like seeds in rich ground. The iron bell rang from the main house. Time to carry coffee to the colonel. Colonel Abram Harwood sat hunched over his ledger in the study. Morning light slanted through the windows, showing the grey in his whiskers and the tight lines around his eyes. He coughed a harsh, scraping sound that made the ink quiver in its well. 12 bales short, he muttered to the open book. 12 damned bales. Lissy stepped quiet as a cat through the door, the coffee tray balanced in her small hands. Steam curled up from the white china cup, carrying the rich smell of roasted beans. "Set it there." The colonel didn't look up. "Mind the papers." As she placed the tray on the desk's edge, her eyes swept over the open ledger. Numbers in neat columns. Names she recognized: Moses, Isaiah, Ruth. Her mother's name, all written in the colonel's careful script. Beside the ledger lay a heavy ring, gold, with a raised seal showing a tree and some Latin words curved around the edge. The wax pressed into a document nearby still held the ring's perfect impression, every line and letter clear as morning. Lissy's lips moved silently as she studied the motto, Veritas et Honor. The shapes burned into her memory like the colonel's brand burned into cattle. "What are you staring at, girl?" She dropped her gaze. "Nothing, master." "Then get on with you." But as she turned to go, voices drifted from the front parlor, men talking low and serious. She recognized the banker's voice, Mr. Silas Barrow from town, sharp words about interest and extensions, and time running short. The kitchen door seemed farther away than usual. Thomas Harwood rode in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and frustration in his shoulders. At 22, he carried himself like a man, still deciding what kind of man to be. His horse stamped and snorted as he dismounted by the side porch. "Isaiah," he called to the stable hand. "Take Sultan, will you? He's been fighting the bit all morning." Through the parlor window came the sound of raised voices. Thomas paused, one boot on the steps, listening. "The girl is of age," his father was saying. "Good family, solid prospects." "Prospects don't pay debts," came another voice. "Mr. Barrow, though I suppose a wedding might. Encourage certain flexibilities." Thomas pushed through the front door, harder than he intended. The latch clicked sharp against the strike plate. His father sat across from the banker, papers spread between them like battle lines. Both men looked up with the careful expressions of people caught planning someone else's life. "Thomas," Colonel Harwood's voice carried warning, "Mr. Barrow was just explaining about Miss Eugenia." "Was he? The banker smiled, all teeth, no warmth. Your father tells me you've been corresponding with my daughter. Lovely girl, well educated. Thomas had written Eugenia exactly 3 letters, each one more polite and empty than the last. She'd responded with pressed flowers and Bible verses copied in perfect penmanship. A union between our families, his father continued, would benefit everyone involved. The way he said, everyone, made it clear he meant himself. And if I'm not inclined toward such benefits? Colonel Harwood's cough turned harsh. When he spoke again, his words came tight with pain and anger. You'll be inclined toward whatever keeps this family from ruin. We're not selling off the quarters because you have romantic notions. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Selling the quarters? Half of them, if need be. The colonel's hand shook slightly as he reached for his coffee. Moses, Isaiah, Ruth, and her girl. Good workers bring top dollar in New Orleans. The names hit Thomas like stones thrown hard. Ruth, who sang while she worked the vegetable garden. Lissy, who remembered every word and returned lost things without being asked. Mr. Barrow gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. Think it over, young man. Eugenia's a catch. And the dowry. He let the words hang. After the banker left, father and son sat in silence. The parlor clock ticked like a slow heartbeat. Is it really so bad? Thomas asked finally. His father closed the ledger with a soft thump. Bad enough that your choices are simple. Marry the girl and save us. Or watch me sell people like horses at market. The words settled between them like dust after a cave-in. Sunday evening brought the household together in the front parlor for prayers. The good chairs faced the fireplace, where Colonel Harwood sat with the large family Bible across his knees. The leather binding showed years of handling, and the pages crackled when he turned them. House servants stood along the back wall. Aunt Dinah, Moses, Isaiah, Ruth, and Lissy. The field hands gathered on the side porch, voices drifting through the open windows. Tonight we read from Ecclesiastes, the colonel announced. His voice carried better for Bible reading than it did for everyday talk. Chapter 3, verse 1. As he read about times and seasons, Lissy watched his finger trace the lines. But when he reached verse 8, the time to love and time to hate, his finger paused over faint handwriting in the margin. Some earlier Harwood had written notes in brown ink, the letters small and careful. The colonel's finger moved past the marginal note without reading it aloud. Lissy squinted, trying to make out the faded words. She caught fragments. The child of my blood. Bondage. Something that looked like manumit, though she couldn't sound it out proper. Thomas sat in the chair beside his father, following along in a smaller Bible. But Lissy noticed his eyes kept drifting to her face, watching her concentrate on the margin notes. When the colonel finished reading, he offered a prayer for the household's prosperity and protection. Everyone bowed heads except Lissy, who was still staring at that margin note, burning every letter into her memory. Amen, came the chorus. As people began to disperse, Thomas lingered by the window. When Lissy walked past, carrying the small Bible back to its shelf, he spoke quietly. You were reading along. She stopped, the book pressed against her chest. No, sir, just listening. You were moving your lips with the words. Even the parts father skipped. Heat climbed her neck. Being able to read was dangerous knowledge for someone like her, but lying to Master Thomas felt just as dangerous. I remember shapes, she said carefully. Sometimes they stick. He studied her face in the lamplight. What did you remember from the margin? She glanced around the empty parlor, then whispered, something about a child, and blood, and a word I don't know how to say. Thomas stepped closer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. That was my Uncle Josiah's handwriting. He died before I was born. The confession hung between them like a secret shared. Outside, dogs were barking at something in the distance. Patrol riders, maybe, or just raccoons in the corn. Either way, the sound made them both remember where they were and what they were. Better get on, Thomas said, stepping back. Yes, sir. But as Lissy carried the Bible away, she felt the weight of his watching her go. 3 days later, Colonel Harwood announced the gala. 2 weeks from Saturday, he told Thomas over breakfast. 50 guests, maybe more. Music, dancing, proper supper. Time to make our intentions known. Thomas's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Our intentions? Your engagement to Miss Eugenia, Public announcement, proper ceremony. Her father's bringing the marriage contract. The words fell like hammer blows. Thomas set down his fork with careful control. In the kitchen, Lissy stood by the door with a pitcher of fresh buttermilk, listening to every word. Aunt Dinah caught her eye and shook her head, a warning to stay invisible. "I haven't agreed to any engagement," Thomas said. "You'll agree." The Colonel's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Because the alternative is watching this place get carved up and sold off piece by piece, including the people." That afternoon, the house erupted into preparation. Aunt Dinah started planning menus. Moses and Isaiah received orders to clear the barn for dancing. Ruth and 2 other women began the endless job of washing and pressing the good linens. Lissy found herself assigned to polish silver and clean the crystal glasses work that required careful hands and sharp eyes. As she worked, scrubbing water spots from wine goblets, she overheard snippets of planning. "The Barrow girl will expect everything perfect," Aunt Dinah murmured to Ruth. "Rich folks notice every speck of dust." "What about after?" Ruth asked quietly. "If the young master marries her?" Aunt Dinah's hands stilled on the serving spoon she was polishing. "Depends on what kind of wife she is. Some want to make changes." "Start fresh." The unspoken meaning was clear. New wives sometimes meant sold servants, clean slates. That evening, Thomas found Lissy in the pantry, counting preserves jars for the gala menu. Lamplight flickered over the neat rows of peaches and pears put up from last summer's harvest. "Lissy," she turned, a pottery jar cradled in her hands. "Are you frightened?" The question caught her off guard. Masters didn't usually ask slaves about being frightened. Fear was supposed to be a given, quiet and manageable as breathing. "About what, Master Thomas?" "About," he gestured helplessly. "About all of this. The gala. What might come after." She set the jar carefully back on its shelf. In the lamplight, her face looked older than her 17 years. "Frightened doesn't change anything," she said finally. "But yes, sir, some." He stepped closer, and she could smell soap and leather and something else, some scent that was just him. "If I could change things," he began, then stopped. "I mean, if there were choices. There are always choices, Master Thomas. Just not always good ones." The simple truth of it seemed to hit him like a slap. He stood quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dancing light. "Would you choose differently, if you could?" The question was loaded with dangers she could barely name. But something in his voice, some desperate honesty, made her answer truthfully. "I'd choose to stay. Here, with my mama and the people I know. But I'd choose to be asked, not told." The distinction seemed to matter to him. He nodded slowly. "At the gala," he said, "you'll be serving. Fanning guests, fetching drinks. Yes, sir, you'll see everything, hear everything. Yes, sir." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Remember what you see, Lissy. All of it. The way you remember letters and words. I always remember everything. I know." That's what scares them. When he was gone, she stood alone among the preserves jars, turning his words over in her mind. That's what scares them. As if her memory were a weapon neither of them quite knew how to use. The night of the gala arrived clear and warm, with a moon that turned the plantation house white as bone. Lanterns hung from every porch post and window frame. The sound of violin and piano drifted from the barn, where Moses had strung paper flowers between the rafters. Lissy wore her cleanest dress grey cotton with a white collar that Ruth had starched stiff as paper. The blue ribbon stayed on her wrist, hidden under her sleeve. She carried a palmetto fan and moved like a shadow between the guests, keeping glasses filled and faces cooled. The ladies wore silk that whispered when they walked. The gentlemen talked loud about cotton prices and politics, their voices mixing with music and laughter. Miss Eugenia Barrow held court near the musicians, her yellow dress bright as buttercups and her smile fixed as painted china. Colonel Harwood moved through the crowd with forced joviality, shaking hands and accepting congratulations on his son's upcoming engagement. But Lissy noticed the tremor in his hands when he lifted his whiskey glass and the way he had to pause to catch his breath between conversations. Thomas stood beside Miss Eugenia, playing his part. But his smiles looked carved from wood, and his eyes kept searching the room until they found Lissy. Near 10 o'clock, as the dancing grew livelier and the gentlemen's voices louder, Thomas excused himself from his betrothed's side. He walked to the refreshment table where Lissy was refilling the lemonade pitcher. "Hot evening?" he said, accepting a glass from her hands. "Yes, sir." Their fingers brushed as she passed him the drink. A brief touch, but enough to send heat up her arm. "The music is lovely," she ventured. "Do you dance, Lissy?" The question was innocent, enough on its surface, but something in his tone made it dangerous. Around them, couples swirled through the Virginia reel, silk skirts spinning like flower petals. "Not that kind of dancing, Master Thomas. What kind do you dance?" She thought of Saturday evenings in the quarters when Moses played his fiddle and the people clapped and stepped to rhythms older than Virginia. Different kind. He moved closer, and she could see her reflection in his dark eyes. The careful distance she'd maintained all evening began to crumble. "I wish," he started, then stopped. From across the barn, Colonel Harwood's voice cut through the music like an axe through kindling. "Boy, don't you dare kiss a black. Do you hear me?" The words crashed over the gathering like cold water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The fiddle screeched to a halt. Every face in the barn turned toward Thomas and Lissy, frozen by the punch table like figures in a painting. Miss Eugenia's fan snapped shut. For one heartbeat, Thomas stood perfectly still. Then he reached out, cupped Lissy's face in both his hands, and kissed her full on the mouth in front of God and 50 witnesses. The kiss lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. When he pulled away, Lissy's eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been wonder. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before thunder. Then Miss Eugenia screamed a high, sharp sound that cut through the night like breaking glass. Someone dropped a crystal punch cup that shattered against the barn floor. Women gasped behind their fans, while men stood with their mouths hanging open like landed fish. Colonel Harwood swayed on his feet, his face purple with rage and mortification. "Thomas, you." But Thomas wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at Lissy, whose hand had risen unconsciously to her lips, as if to keep the kiss safe there. The music was over. The engagement was over. Whatever careful plans the Harwood family had laid were scattered like leaves in a storm, and in the shocked silence that followed, Lissy could hear her own heart beating like a drum, calling people to war. By morning, news of the kiss had spread through the parish like floodwater through lowland. The barrow carriage left before dawn, wheels throwing gravel and dust. Miss Eugenia didn't bother with farewell calls. In the main house, Colonel Harwood paced the study like a caged bear. His breathing came harsh and shallow, and every few steps he had to grip the desk edge to steady himself. "Mad," he wheezed at Thomas, who stood by the window watching the empty road. "Stone mad is what you are." Thomas turned from the glass. "Perhaps you think this is some joke? Some game?" The colonel's voice cracked. "You've ruined us, boy. Ruined everything." From the kitchen came the muted sounds of normal morning work, Aunt Dinah grinding coffee, Ruth feeding the fire. But underneath the everyday noises was something else. Careful, quiet, as if the whole household was holding its breath. "I won't apologize for it," Thomas said. His father's hand slammed down on the desk hard enough to make the inkwell jump. "You'll do more than apologize. You'll fix this. Write to Eugenia. Beg her forgiveness. Tell her it was temporary madness. Too much whiskey. And if she won't forgive—" Colonel Harwood sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. "Then I sell the girl and her mother to the first trader heading downriver. Tonight, if I have to." The threat hung between them like smoke from a green fire. Pike, the overseer, found his opportunity in the chaos. A lean man with yellow teeth and hands that never seemed clean, he'd been watching the Harwood troubles like a buzzard watches dying cattle. He knocked on the study door near midday, hat in hand but eyes calculating. "Colonel, sir, about the situation." Harwood looked up from his ledger with exhausted eyes. "What about it?" "The girl and her mother, causing talk in the quarters, unsettling the others." Pike shifted his weight, a careful performance. "Best to handle it quick and quiet." Thomas stepped forward. "Handle what?" Pike's smile was thin as paper. "Transport. Know a man with a boat at Milliken's Bend. Discreet. Takes cargo downriver. No questions asked." "She's not cargo?" Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "Course not." Pike's tone stayed reasonable, but his eyes glittered. "Just saying, sometimes problems solve themselves if you act fast enough." Colonel Harwood studied both men, weighing options like a merchant weighing gold. Finally, he nodded. "Make the arrangements, but nothing happens until I say so." Pike touched his hat brim. "Yes, sir. I'll just prepare things." In case, when he was gone, Thomas faced his father across the cluttered desk. "You can't do this. Watch me." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm weather coming. That afternoon, while the house dozed in the sultry heat, Lissy was sent to dust the colonel's study. She worked with extra care, knowing eyes were watching her every move now. The desk held its usual clutter of papers, but as she lifted the inkwell to clean beneath it, she saw something that made her hands still. A new document lay half-hidden under the colonel's tobacco pouch. The seal at the bottom caught her eye, red wax pressed with a familiar design. But when she looked closer, her breath caught. The seal was wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different from the Harwood ring she'd memorized. The Latin words curved the same way, but one letter was clearly crooked, the R in honor, twisted slightly to the right, and the wax was brighter red than she remembered, without the dark spots that marked the old ring's impression. Lissy glanced toward the door, then bent closer to study the document. Legal language mostly, but she caught key phrases: transfer of property, satisfaction of debt, banker's lien. Footsteps creaked in the hallway. She straightened quickly, busying herself with the tobacco pouch just as the colonel entered. "Finished in here, girl?" "Fiver's sane." "Almost, master." She kept her eyes down, but her mind was racing. Why would the seal be different? Who had pressed this wax? "Get on with you, then." As she gathered her dust cloths, Colonel Harwood settled into his chair and pulled the document closer, unaware that every detail had already been burned into the girl's memory. That evening, Lissy found Thomas in the stable, brushing down Sultan with angry strokes that made the horse sidestep nervously. "Master Thomas." He looked up, his face creased with worry and exhaustion. "Lissy, you shouldn't be here. Not now. I need to tell you something." "About the papers." The brush stilled in his hand. "What papers?" She moved closer, keeping her voice low. "On your father's desk, there's a document with a seal that's not right." "Not right how?" "The mark on the ring you showed me, the family seal. It's different from the mark on those papers. One letter's crooked, and the wax is too bright." Thomas set down the brush and gave her his full attention. "You're certain?" "I remember everything I see, Master Thomas. The seal on that document isn't from your family ring." He was quiet for a long moment, processing what this might mean. "If not our seal, then whose? I don't know. But somebody wants it to look like your seal." The implications hit him like a physical blow. "The banker's lawyer. He's been handling documents for father. If he's forging our seal, he could be stealing your land right from under you," Lissy finished. Thunder rumbled closer now, and the air felt heavy with coming rain. Sultan stamped and snorted, sensing the storm. "Show me," Thomas said suddenly. "Sir?" "The papers. Show me what you saw." She shook her head. "Can't just walk into your father's study now. Not after I kissed you." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. "Yes, sir." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "There has to be a way. If that lawyer is cheating us." Lightning flickered outside, followed by the first fat drops of rain on the stable roof. "The Bible," Lissy said suddenly. "What about it?" "The marginal note you showed me. Your uncle's handwriting. If there's something in there about the seal or the family, might be worth another look." Thomas nodded slowly. "Tomorrow's Sunday. Father will take the Bible to church for his reading. Then we look tonight." The rain began in earnest, drumming on the roof like restless fingers. In the distance, dogs barked at the thunder, their voices rising and falling like a hymn to the storm. Near midnight, when the house lay quiet except for rain and settling timber, Thomas slipped down to the church basement where the Harwood Bible was kept between Sundays. A single candle lit his way through the narrow corridor between stored pews and stacked hymnals. Lissy met him at the side door, her hair damp with rain and her bare feet silent on the brick floor. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered. "Sure as I can be." The Bible sat on the communion table, its leather binding black in the candlelight. Thomas opened it carefully to Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, and held the flame close to the margin. "There," Lissy breathed, pointing to the faded brown ink. "That's what your father skipped over." Thomas squinted at his uncle's careful script. The writing was faint, but readable if you knew how to look. Should the child of my blood, born under bondage, reach the age of 21, he read slowly, such child and her issue shall be manumitted according to my oath before God, sealed with this ring and witnessed by his word. They looked at each other across the candlelight. Child of my blood, Lissy repeated, born under bondage. Uncle Josiah never married, never had legitimate children. But if he... Thomas let the implication hang. If he had a child with one of the slaves, and that child had a child, their eyes met again. The mathematics was simple enough. Josiah Harwood had died 25 years ago. If he'd fathered a daughter, who later bore a child of her own. My mama, Lissy whispered. She's never told me who her father was, just said he was a good man who died young. Thunder crashed overhead, and rain beat harder against the small windows. In the candle's dancing light, the faded words seemed to pulse with life. Lissy, Thomas's voice was careful. How old is your mother? 42. And you? 17. Come harvest. The numbers fit like pieces in a puzzle. If Ruth was Josiah's daughter, then Lissy was his granddaughter. Free by right, according to the margin note, if it held any legal weight. But why didn't your father honor this? Lissy asked. If it's written right here in the family Bible? Thomas studied the page more closely. Look at the ink. This was written after the main text was printed. Uncle Josiah must have added it himself. Maybe as a private promise he meant to formalize later. But he died before he could. And Father either never noticed or chose to ignore it. Lightning lit the basement windows like daylight for a split second, then faded back to candor glow. In that brief illumination, both their faces looked older, marked by knowledge they weren't sure they wanted. What now? Lissy asked. Thomas closed the Bible carefully. Now we find out if a promise written in brown ink can stand against a plantation full of debt and a banker with a forged seal. The candle flame danced between them, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward truths still hidden in the darkness. The storm hit full force near dawn, turning roads to mud and creeks to torrents. But it didn't stop the messenger, who splashed up to the main house with news that made Colonel Harwood's face go white. Mr. Barrow was coming, today, with the sheriff and his lawyer, papers in hand, to settle the matter of debts and damaged reputations. How long do we have? Thomas asked as his father read the rain-stained note. 2 hours, maybe 3, if the roads slow them down. Pike appeared at the study door like he'd been listening at the keyhole. Colonel, about that transport we discussed. Yes, Harwood's voice came out cracked. Do it now. Before they arrive, Thomas stepped between Pike and the door. You will not. Boy, don't test me. Not today. I said no. Colonel Harwood rose from his chair with effort, his breathing labored. That girl is the source of our ruin. If she's gone when Barrow arrives, we might still salvage something. And if she stays, then we're all finished, every last one of us. From the kitchen came the sound of normal morning work, but Lissy wasn't there. Ruth worked alone, her movements quick and nervous as she prepared breakfast no one would eat. Where is she? Pike asked. Ruth's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Who, sir? Don't play ignorant. The girl. Where's Lissy? Don't rightly know. Haven't seen her since yesterday evening. Pike's eyes narrowed. Check the quarters, check the fields, find her. As the overseer stalked out into the rain, Thomas caught Ruth's eye. Something passed between them, a quick understanding that needed no words. Lissy wasn't in the quarters or the fields because she wasn't hiding. She was gone, slipped away in the storm's darkness with her mother's help and Thomas's desperate blessing. Somewhere on the muddy roads, a girl with perfect memory and dangerous knowledge was making her way toward town and whatever sanctuary she might find there. The clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. In the distance, thunder still rolled like wagon wheels on a wooden bridge. Time was running out for everyone. Lissy hadn't gone to town after all. She stood now in the church basement, water dripping from her dress onto the brick floor. The Harwood Bible lay open before her in the grey morning light that filtered through rain-streaked windows. I couldn't leave, she said to Thomas, who'd found her there when he came looking for sanctuary of his own. Not with that document sitting on your father's desk and nobody knowing what it means. Lissy, Barrow's coming with the sheriff. If they find you here, Then we better figure out the truth before they arrive. She pointed to the marginal note in Josiah's careful script. Read it again. All of it. Thomas held the Bible closer to the window. Should the child of my blood born under bondage reach the age of 21, such child and her issue shall be manumitted according to my oath before God, sealed with this ring and witnessed by his word. Sealed with this ring, Lissy repeated. Your uncle's ring, the one on your father's desk. The family seal ring, yes, but what if it's not the same ring? Thomas looked up from the page. What do you mean? What if there were 2 rings? One for your father, one for your uncle? And what if the document on your father's desk was sealed with the wrong ring? The possibility hit him like cold water. If Uncle Josiah had his own seal ring, and someone's been forging documents with a different ring, then anything sealed with the false ring would be worthless in court. Thunder rolled overhead, but softer now. The storm was moving east, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and new possibilities. We need to find Uncle Josiah's ring, Thomas said. Where would he have kept it? Thomas thought hard. His personal effects went to the attic when he died. Father stored them there and never looked through them proper. Rain still pattered on the windows as they made their way back to the main house. The front rooms were empty. Colonel Harwood was in his study, doors closed, probably trying to make sense of papers before Barrow arrived. The attic stairs creaked under their feet. At the top, dusty sunlight slanted through a single window, illuminating stored furniture and trunks that hadn't been opened in years. That one, Thomas said, pointing to a leather trunk bound with brass corners. Josiah Harwood was burned into the lid in careful letters. Inside the trunk, wrapped in yellowed cloth, lay the remnants of a life cut short, a brass compass, a few books with Latin titles, a small wooden cross, and at the bottom, in a cloth bag that had once been blue silk, a heavy gold ring. Lissy lifted it to the attic light. The seal was identical to Colonel Harwood's ring in design, the tree, the Latin motto, but when she looked closer, she could see the difference. The letters are sharper, she said. Cleaner. And look, she pointed to the R in honor. This one's straight. Perfect. Thomas compared it to his memory of his father's ring. Father's ring has that bent letter. I always thought it was wear from years of use, or it was made by someone who copied the original but didn't get it quite right. The implications were staggering. If Colonel Harwood's ring was a fake, then every document he'd sealed over the years might be legally worthless, including any agreements with Barrow. But how? Thomas asked. Father's had that ring since before I was born. Lissy turned the true ring in her hands, feeling its weight. What if your uncle left this one to my mama, as proof of his promise? And someone gave your father a copy so he'd never know the difference? Who would do that? Someone who wanted the real ring hidden until the time came to use it. From downstairs came the sound of horses in the yard, carriage wheels on gravel, voices calling through the rain. Barrow had arrived. Thomas took the ring from Lissy's hands and slipped it into his pocket. Can you get to the kitchen without being seen? Yes. Find your mother, tell her what we've found, and stay hidden until this is over. As they crept down the attic stairs, the front door opened with a bang. Mister. Barrow's voice filled the hallway loud, confident, bringing the weight of law and money with him. Harwood, we need to talk. In the front parlor, 3 men faced Colonel Harwood across a table that hadn't been used for anything pleasant in months. Mr. Silas Barrow sat in the middle, flanked by his lawyer, Mr. Hume, and Sheriff Clements, a fair-minded man caught between law and politics. The matter's simple, Barrow said, spreading papers on the table. My daughter's reputation has been damaged, the engagement contract broken, and your debts to my bank are in arrears. Colonel Harwood's breathing came harsh in the quiet room. The boy made a mistake. Young men do foolish things. Kissing a slave girl in public isn't foolish, Harwood. It's obscene. Thomas stood by the window, watching Pike and 2 other men saddle horses in the yard, getting ready to search for Lissy, no doubt. However, Barrow continued, I'm prepared to be reasonable. Sign this transfer of property. He tapped a document with a bright red seal, and I'll forgive the debts. You'll retain a small portion of the land and continue as manager under my oversight. And if I refuse? Hume, the lawyer, spoke for the first time. Then the sheriff executes this seizure order. Today, all property, including slaves, will be auctioned to satisfy the debt. Sheriff Clements cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'd rather not, Colonel, but if the documents are in order." Thomas pulled Uncle Josiah's ring from his pocket. "Sheriff, I wonder if you'd examine the seal on that contract." Barrow frowned. "What's this about?" "Just curious about the seal, family history and such." Clements took the contract and held it to the window light. The wax gleamed bright red, showing every detail of the pressed design. Thomas placed the true ring on the table beside the document. "Now, compare them." The room went dead quiet as Sheriff Clements studied ring and seal. His weathered face grew troubled as he noticed what Lissy had seen, the slight differences that marked one seal as false. "Mr. Hume," he said slowly, "this doesn't match." The lawyer leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "This document's sealed with a ring that's not quite the same as this one. Letters bent different. Wax is the wrong shade." Barrow's confident expression began to crack. "That's impossible. I watched Harwood seal that contract myself." "No, sir," Thomas said quietly. "You watched someone seal it with a counterfeit ring. This is the true Harwood seal, left to us by my uncle." From the hallway came the sound of doors opening and closing. Pike, searching the house for Lissy. Hume grabbed for the contract, but Sheriff Clements held it firm. "I'm thinking we need to examine this more careful, if there's fraud involved." "Fraud?" Barrow's voice cracked like a whip. "Who's talking about fraud?" "Anyone who uses a false seal to forge legal documents," Thomas said, "which I believe is a hanging offense in Louisiana." The banker pushed back from the table, his face red with anger and something that might have been fear. "You can't prove anything, can't we?" Thomas looked toward the doorway, where Lissy had appeared like a ghost made solid. In her hands, she carried another document, one Thomas recognized as the paper she'd seen on his father's desk. "This girl's got a perfect memory for shapes and marks," he said. "And she's seen your lawyer's seal before." Sheriff Clements gestured Lissy forward. "Child, you're saying you've seen documents sealed with the wrong ring?" Lissy's voice came clear and steady. "Yes, sir. This paper here," she held up the document from the desk, "and others, all pressed with a seal that doesn't match the true Harwood ring." Hume started to object, but Clements cut him off. "Let her speak. The letter R is bent to the right in the false seal, and the wax is bright red, not the dark red of proper sealing wax. I seen the difference, and I remember it." As Lissy spoke, footsteps pounded on the front porch. Pike burst through the door, his face flushed with anger and rain. "She's not in the house," he announced. "Not in the quarters either." Barrow pointed at Lissy. "There she is, you fool." Pike's hand moved to the pistol at his belt. "Want me to handle this now?" "Stand down, Pike." Sheriff Clements's voice carried the weight of law. "Nobody's handling anything until we get to the bottom of this." But Pike wasn't listening to the sheriff. His eyes were fixed on Lissy with the intensity of a man who saw his future slipping away. "That girl's caused nothing but trouble," he said. "Time to end it." The pistol cleared leather with a smooth, practiced motion. Thomas stepped between Pike and Lissy. "Put that away. Stand aside, boy." I said, "Put it away." Colonel Harwood struggled to his feet. "Pike, what are you doing? Saving us all from ruin. Should have drowned this one at birth." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Even Barrow looked shocked by the naked hatred in Pike's voice. "You see," Thomas said to the sheriff, "this is what we're dealing with. A man who'd murder a girl to cover up fraud." Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. "Not murder. Justice." "For whom?" a new voice asked from the doorway. Ruth stepped into the room, her face calm but her eyes burning. In her hands she carried an object wrapped in faded blue silk. "For the man who's been stealing from these people for 20 years, she continued, "or for the one who's been covering it up?" She unwrapped the silk to reveal another seal ring older than the others, with a design that matched Uncle Josiah's exactly. "My father left me this ring when he died," she said quietly. "Told me to keep it safe until the right time came. Seems like that time is now." The revelation hit the room like lightning strikes an oak tree. Ruth stood holding the proof of her parentage and Lissy's freedom, while Pike's pistol wavered between targets. Sheriff Clements found his voice first. "Ma'am, you're saying Josiah Harwood was your father?" "Yes, sir. And that makes Lissy his granddaughter, with rights according to what he wrote in the family Bible." Colonel Harwood sank back into his chair, his face grey as winter ash. "Ruth, I never knew for certain. You knew. Her voice was steady as stone. You just chose not to see. Pike's pistol swung toward Ruth. Shut your mouth, woman. But Sheriff Clements was already moving. His hand closed on Pike's wrist with the grip of a man who'd handled trouble before. That's enough. The pistol discharged into the ceiling, sending plaster dust down like snow. In the sudden ringing silence that followed, everyone could hear the sound of rain on the roof and their own hearts beating. Barrow was on his feet, gathering papers with shaking hands. This is ridiculous. A slave woman claims kinship with a white family, and you take her word. I take the word of evidence, Clements said, still holding Pike's wrist. And the evidence says we got fraud, attempted murder, and a whole tangle of lies that's going to take some unraveling. He nodded toward the documents on the table. These papers you brought, they're sealed with a false ring. That makes them worthless in law. You can't know that for certain. Can and do. Clements released Pike with a shove that sent the overseer stumbling backward. And this man just tried to shoot witnesses to cover it up. Thomas moved to stand beside Lissy and Ruth. 3 generations of hidden truth finally brought to light. Sheriff, he said, there's something else you should know. The manumission clause in the family Bible, it names Lissy as free by law on her 21st birthday. She's not 21, Barrow sputtered. No, sir. But the clause says, should the child reach the age of 21. Uncle Josiah was giving her rights that could be claimed early, if justice demanded it. Clements studied the 3 rings now lying on the table, true seal, false seal, and Ruth's inheritance. The evidence was clear as daylight after storm. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that justice demands it right now. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the windows came the sound of birds returning to their singing, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour like a celebration just begun. 3 days later, the courthouse in Milliken's Bend drew a crowd like a camp meeting draws sinners. Word had spread through the parish about the Harwood troubles, the forbidden kiss, the forged seals, the slave girl who could read Latin and remember every mark she'd ever seen. Sheriff Clements had called for a formal hearing to sort truth from lies, and half the county came to watch. Inside the courthouse, morning light slanted through tall windows onto pine benches packed with planters, merchants, preachers, and anyone else curious enough to ride through mud for a spectacle. The air smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and the human mixture of sweat and soap. Judge Marcus Clements, the sheriff's older brother, presided from behind a scarred oak desk that had seen 20 years of disputes over land, debt, and the complicated business of owning people. This court, he announced, will examine evidence regarding the Harwood estate, claims of fraud, and certain unusual circumstances requiring legal clarification. At the plaintiff's table sat Mr. Barrow and his lawyer, Hume, their papers arranged in neat stacks that couldn't hide the worry in their eyes. At the defendant's table, Thomas sat beside his father, who looked smaller than anyone remembered, as if the truth had worn him down to his actual size. In the back corner, near the colored section, Lissy sat with Ruth and Aunt Dinah. She wore her cleanest dress and kept her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes missed nothing. Mr. Hume, Judge Clements said, present your claim. The lawyer stood, papers rustling. Your Honor, the Harwood family owes significant debts to Mr. Barrow's bank. These documents, he held up the contracts with their bright red seals, detail the terms of payment and authorize transfer of property to satisfy the obligation. And these documents are sealed with what you claim to be the official Harwood seal? Correct, Your Honor, witnessed and executed in proper form. Judge Clements gestured toward the evidence table. Show me. Hume approached with the contract, placing it beside the 3 rings Sheriff Clements had collected the true Harwood seal, the false one, and Ruth's inheritance from her father. Now, the judge said, pulling on his spectacles, let's see what we're dealing with. The room fell so quiet you could hear dust settling on windowsills as Judge Clements examined the seals. He pressed the true ring into fresh red wax, then compared it to the mark on Hume's document. Interesting, he murmured. Mr. Hume, are you familiar with the penalties for using a false seal in legal documents? The lawyer's face went pale. Your Honor, I assure you these documents are legitimate. That's not what I asked. The judge's voice carried the weight of final authority. I asked if you knew the penalties. Yes, Your Honor. Good. Because this seal, he pointed to the contract, doesn't match this ring. He indicated the true Harwood seal. Different wax, different impression. One letter clearly bent where it should be straight. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom like wind through wheat. Barrow shot to his feet. "Your Honor, surely a small variation. Sit down, Mr. Barrow." Judge Clements's tone could have frozen July. "Sheriff, call your first witness." Sheriff Clements stood. "The court calls Miss Lissy, daughter of Ruth." A hush fell over the room. In 1,850 seconds, Louisiana, slaves rarely testified in legal proceedings and never against white men. But this was no ordinary case. Lissy walked to the witness box with her spine straight and her eyes forward. Some people in the gallery leaned forward to get a better look at the girl who'd caused such a stir. "Miss Judge," Clements said gently, "you understand you're under oath before God and this court?" "Yes, sir. Tell us about your ability to remember things you've seen." Lissy's voice came clear in the hushed room. "I remember everything, sir. Every word I hear, every mark I see. They stay in my mind like they were burned there. And you've seen documents with false seals?" "Yes, sir. The papers on Colonel Harwood's desk, and others. The seal was wrong, bright red wax instead of dark, and the R in honor bent to the right." Judge Clements held up Hume's contract. "Like this document?" "Exactly like that one, sir." The judge turned to address the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this girl can recite entire pages of scripture after hearing them once. She remembers every detail of every conversation she's witnessed. Sheriff Clements has tested her abilities extensively." He looked back at Lissy. "How long have you seen documents with false seals?" "Near 3 years, sir, since Mr. Pike started bringing papers for Colonel Harwood to sign." A new murmur swept the room. Pike sat in the back, under guard, his face dark with rage. "The court calls Mrs. Ruth," Sheriff Clements announced. Ruth walked forward with dignity that made the fine ladies in the gallery take notice. When she placed her hand on the Bible to swear her oath, the blue silk ring wrapping lay visible in her other palm. "Mrs. Ruth," Judge Clements said, "you claim Josiah Harwood was your father." "He was, sir." "How do you know this?" "He told me himself, sir, when I was small. Said he loved my mother true, and me as his own child, even though law wouldn't let him claim me proper. And he left you something to remember him by." Ruth unwrapped the silk to reveal the third ring. "This was his seal ring, sir, the true one. He said to keep it safe until justice needed proving." Judge Clements took the ring and examined it closely. The design matched the others exactly, but the craftsmanship was finer, the Latin letters carved with perfect precision. "This appears to be the original," he said slowly. "Which would make the ring Colonel Harwood has been using." "A copy," Thomas said from the defendant's table, "made to fool him into thinking he had the real seal, while the true one stayed hidden." Colonel Harwood struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. "Your Honor, I never knew. I thought the ring my brother left me was genuine." "Where did you get it, Colonel?" "Pike brought it to me after Josiah died. Said he found it in my brother's effects." All eyes turned toward the overseer, who sat like a cornered animal in the back corner. "It seems," Judge Clements said dryly, "that Mr. Pike has been very helpful over the years." The judge picked up the family Bible, which Thomas had brought as evidence. "Now, about this manumission clause written in the margin," he read the faded brown ink aloud. "Should the child of my blood born under bondage reach the age of 21, such child and her issue shall be manumitted according to my oath before God, sealed with this ring and witnessed by his word." "Mrs. Ruth, you are the child referenced here?" "I believe so, sir." "And Miss Lissy would be your issue, your daughter?" "Yes, sir." Judge Clements set the Bible down with reverent care. "The handwriting has been examined by experts and confirmed as Josiah Harwood's. The intent is clear. Under the terms of this manumission clause, both Ruth and Lissy should be considered free persons under the law." The courthouse erupted like a pot boiling over. Voices rose in excitement, outrage, and confusion as people tried to make sense of what they'd just heard. Judge Clements banged his gavel until order returned. "This court rules as follows." The room held its breath. "First, the documents presented by Mr. Hume are sealed with false impressions and therefore invalid. The attempted seizure of Harwood property is voided." Barrow's face went purple. Second, the manumission clause written by Josiah Harwood in the family Bible constitutes a binding legal commitment. Ruth and her daughter Lissy are hereby declared free persons under Louisiana law. Gasps echoed through the gallery. In the back section, Moses and Isaiah and Aunt Dinah gripped each other's hands. Third, Mr. Pike is charged with fraud, forgery, and attempted murder. Sheriff, take him into custody. As Pike was led away in irons, his face twisted with hatred, Judge Clements continued. Finally, this court recognizes that unusual circumstances require unusual remedies. The Harwood family will retain their land, but under new terms that reflect the truth we've discovered here. He turned to Thomas. Young man, do you accept responsibility for your family's debts and for ensuring the welfare of all people on your land? Thomas stood. I do, Your Honor. Then draw up a household charter detailing wages for labor, schooling opportunities, and a firm commitment that no human being will be bought or sold on Harwood land again. Yes, sir. Judge Clements looked around the packed courtroom. This hearing is concluded. Justice has been served, though it took longer than it should have. The courthouse steps overflowed with people as the hearing ended. Some came to congratulate the Harwoods on keeping their land. Others wanted to shake Lissy's hand or get a closer look at the girl who'd toppled a conspiracy with her perfect memory. Colonel Harwood leaned heavily on Thomas's arm, his face grey but peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. The weight of lies and debts had lifted from his shoulders, leaving him lighter but also smaller. Son, he said, quietly, I owe you an apology. And her. He nodded toward Lissy, who stood with Ruth near the courthouse doors. Save your strength, father. No. This needs saying. Abram Harwood raised his voice so the crowd could hear. 3 days ago, I shouted, don't you dare kiss a black. I was wrong. Wrong about many things. The crowd grew quiet, sensing something significant. That young woman, Lissy, she's my niece, my blood kin. And I've treated her like property when I should have treated her like family. He straightened as much as his failing health allowed. I'm an old man who took too long to see the truth. But I see it now. Thomas moved to stand beside Lissy and Ruth. Father's right. We've been a broken family for too long. Time to fix what we can. In full view of the gathered crowd, Thomas placed his hand gently on Lissy's shoulder, not the desperate, defiant gesture of the night at the gala, but something calmer. Acceptance, recognition. Some people in the crowd nodded approval. Others looked uncomfortable but didn't voice objections. Times were changing, slowly and unevenly, but changing nonetheless. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday evening when the air hung soft and sweet with honeysuckle, a small congregation gathered in the country chapel for a service unlike any they'd held before. Reverend Boone kept his sermon short, making room for testimonies. Moses spoke about freedom earned through patience and faith. Aunt Dinah thanked God for prayers answered in unexpected ways. Isaiah, rarely talkative, surprised everyone by standing to say that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied. When the testimonies ended, Lissy rose to lead a hymn. Her voice, clear and true, carried the melody while others joined the harmony. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. In the third pew, Colonel Harwood sat with his eyes closed, his breathing steady for the first time in months. The rhythm of Lissy's singing seemed to calm the wheeze in his chest, just as her counting had steadied his heartbeat that night by the river. As the last note faded, Thomas stood to read from a simple document, written on plain paper, the household charter he'd drafted and signed. It promised fair wages for all work, schooling for any child who wanted learning, and medical care for the sick and elderly. Most importantly, it pledged that no human being would ever again be bought, sold, or treated as property on Harwood land. This is our new beginning, Thomas said as he finished reading. Not perfect, but honest. Not easy, but right. After the service, people lingered in the churchyard, reluctant to let the evening end. Children chased fireflies between the headstones, while adults talked quietly about crops and weather and the changes coming to their part of the world. Lissy walked to the small cottage by the river that Thomas had arranged for her and Ruth too, rooms with a stone fireplace and windows facing east toward the sunrise. The cottage sat on Harwood land but belonged to them now, deed signed and sealed with the true family ring. On the rough pine table by the window, she placed the family Bible and Josiah's ring side by side. Lamplight caught the gold and made the leather binding glow warm as honey. Ruth sat in the rocking chair Thomas had made himself, her fingers working a piece of embroidery, white flowers on blue cloth, like the ribbon that still circled Lissy's wrist. "You tired, child?" "Some, but good tired." Through the open window came the sound of crickets and the distant splash of fish jumping in the river. Somewhere in the main house, a lamp burned in Colonel Harwood's window as Thomas read aloud from one of his father's favorite books. Lissy touched the blue ribbon on her wrist, the same one she'd worn through everything. It was faded now, soft with age and washing, but still strong enough to hold memories and promises. "Mama?" "Yes, child? What do you think happens next?" Ruth smiled, her needle catching the lamplight. "Same as always happens next. Tomorrow comes, and we meet it the best we can." Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. A warm breeze stirred the honeysuckle and carried with it the sound of evening prayers being offered up from the quarters, the main house, and the small cottage where two free women sat by lamplight, planning their tomorrows.